In this lesson, you're going to get practice applying the Treasury stock method that we just went through in the previous video. And what I've done in this model that you see in front of you right here is I've modified some of the numbers to make them a little more friendly in terms of answering interview questions, figuring out what's going on in this model, and also doing some of this math in your head, which is potentially a situation that could come up in the context of interviews. So rather than dealing with 192.06 and 934,735,000 and numbers like that, I've switched this so we're dealing with 10, 100, 1, 10, and so on. So what I want you to do for this exercise is to look at these four different tranches of options, tranche A through tranche D, and I want you to go in and actually calculate the dilution yourself. Now in interviews, when you get a question like this, normally it's easier because they'll just give you one tranche of options for the most part, but potentially you could get more than that. And just to get some practice with the Treasury stock method and figuring out what's going on here, I want you to go through and actually calculate the dilution from each of these four different tranches. Now remember here that the key fact is that you assume number of options equals number of new shares, but you also assume that the company gets cash from exercised options. So keep these two facts in mind as you go through and calculate the dilution here. Now it doesn't matter what approach you could take. If you want, you could just calculate it by hard coding in numbers and doing calculations based on these numbers here, or you could try to recreate the formula that we went through in the previous video. But in any case, just go through right now yourself and try to calculate the dilution from each of these. Once you do this, I'm going to then walk you through the same exercise and you can check your work against what I do on the screen. So pause this video right now and try to calculate the dilution from each of these four different tranches of options. Okay, good. So I'm going to take the approach of actually going through and filling in the formula for each one of these, but it's going to be good just to get some practice reviewing how it works and the mechanics of the Treasury stock method here. So for the first one, now we see that the exercise price here is 8, which means we will definitely get dilution because it's below the share price of $10. So I'm going to say if this is above $10, then it's 0. Otherwise, we take our number of options and then we subtract how much cash the company is getting. How much cash the company is getting is just the 10 times the exercise price of 8. And then we're going to be using that cash to repurchase the shares on the open market. So I'm going to divide by the share price of 10 right here. Now another way to think about that is that you're creating 10 new shares, but you're also giving the company 10 times $80 worth of new cash, or $80 worth of new cash. So with that $80 worth of new cash, the share price is $10 per share. 80 divided by 10 is 8 new shares. So that's another way you could think about that. And in interviews, I recommend you actually use this approach because that's just the easiest way to think through these questions on the Treasury stock method. Now moving on to the others, I'm just going to recreate this formula again. If the exercise price is above $10 per share, we're going to say 0. Otherwise, we're going to take the number of options and then subtract the amount of cash, the number of options times the exercise price, divided by the company's current share price. I can actually just copy this formula down as well. We see that we get dilution for tranche A, for tranche B, tranche C, but not for tranche D, which makes sense because the exercise price here is $13. Another way you can check your work with this type of question, especially in interviews, is that if you have round numbers like this and the share price is 10 or 100 or something like that, then the dilution, assuming you have an even number of shares here as well, is going to be the reverse of the exercise price. So we see the exercise price here is 80, so we get 2 dilution. 5, we get 5 dilution. 3, we get 7 dilution. So it always adds up to 10 in these cases where we have very even numbers like this. So that's one quick trick you can use to check your mental math in the context of interviews when you get questions like this. We see here that it adds up to 14, so we have 114 diluted shares outstanding, and a diluted equity value of 1,140 right here. Now, if you get this question in an interview, you should have a good idea of how to go through it numerically, but if they ask you to actually walk through the Treasury stock method, I would say something like the following. In the Treasury stock method, you calculate dilution by assuming that you create a certain number of shares from options, and then the company uses the cash that you give it to repurchase shares that are outstanding on the common market. The way you actually calculate it for a given tranche of options is you check first to see whether the exercise price exceeds the share price. If that's true, you have no dilution. If it's not true, then you simply take the number of options, then you subtract the number of options times the exercise price divided by the share price. And what this is doing is you're saying that there would be a certain number of new shares out there, but you're decreasing the amount of new shares by taking the cash the company gets and then dividing it by the share price to represent how many of its own shares it could now repurchase. So that's how you'd walk through the Treasury stock method in the context of an interview. So hopefully now you have a much better idea of how the Treasury stock method and options work in the context of valuation. Coming up next, we're going to be looking at another dilutive security, which is called a convertible bond. And we'll be seeing how it is similar and different to options and how we take that into account in evaluation and some of the key formulas and metrics surrounding convertible bonds.